I begin there not with the Old Testament at all, but with 1 Timothy 2:13 to 15. Now, traditionally this is ascribed to St. Paul. Scholars today tend to doubt that. Let's keep on ascribing it to St. Paul for the purpose of tonight. And St. Paul is speaking about women in the church, and he's saying that women should keep silent in the church. So I just would like to begin there, because it's always a good idea to alienate most of your audience before you even begin. But that's not the point I'm getting at. The point I'm getting at is in verses 13 to 15 of the second chapter of 1 Timothy. He says, "For Adam was formed first." I'll just take the Revised Standard Version translation there immediately underneath the Greek. "For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet woman will be saved through bearing children, if she continues in faith and love and holiness with modesty." Now, you might think that argument is not too hot, but whatever you think of it, it's certainly very strange, because not only is this very strange to our modern ears that a woman would be saved through bearing children, it's also very strange in the context of the New Testament, which of course says that we are saved through the grace of Christ and through lives of faith, hope and charity, not through bearing children or otherwise. And the other modern translations which I've listed there, the New International Version, New American Bible, Jerusalem Bible, all say much the same. They say, New International Version, "But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love and holiness with propriety." New American Bible, "But she will be saved through motherhood, provided women persevere in faith and love and holiness with self-control." Jerusalem Bible, "Nevertheless she will be saved by childbearing, provided she lives a modest life and is constant in faith and love and holiness." The Jerusalem Bible then adds a note, "It is not clear whether Paul is implying that women are saved by the one body relationship with their marriage partners, or whether childbearing itself as the mediation of life and the bringing up of children constitutes a vocation." He may quite easily have been thinking specifically of the false teachers who condemn marriage in 1 Timothy 4:3. So we're left with a statement here in St. Paul which is, let's admit it, fairly repugnant to our modern sensibilities, also very much at odds with the soteriology of the New Testament, and thirdly, very difficult to interpret. The Jerusalem Bible itself isn't too sure what St. Paul is talking about. And then the last thing that I have there on of the translations is a literal translation of the Greek. It says, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So far, so good for the Revised Standard Version. But then the RSV says, "Yet woman will be saved through bearing children." In fact, what St. Paul says is that she, most likely she, it could be she, he, or it, will be saved through the childbirth if they abide in faith and love and holiness with self-control or modesty or moderation or whatever. She will be saved through the childbirth. And I would just like to say to you, in my opinion, that the reason why all these modern translations paraphrase rather than actually translate this passage and bring about such an extremely strange and incongruous translation which quite simply doesn't work, is because they've missed out on the importance of the childbirth. And this is what tonight's talk is about, is that the reason why St. Paul doesn't even feel it necessary to explain himself here as to what the childbirth is because this idea of the mother giving birth to the child, the mother and the child, is such a huge concept in the background of the Old Testament and running into the New Testament that he doesn't even feel it necessary to explain himself. And it's precisely because the modern translations have missed out on that they give such a very strange and incongruous translation, which in the context of the New Testament, as I've said a few times, makes absolutely no sense. So the purpose of my talk tonight is really to bring to you the presence of that motif of the mother and child. Often we think as Catholics or as Christians that the idea of devotion to Mary begins at the very earliest with St. Luke in let's say, the 70s, 80s, 90s of the first century, gathers speed in the 2nd and 3rd century. And what I really want to do is to take you on a tour of some passages in both the Old and the New Testaments to show how the figure of the mother and child in our idea of salvation isn't actually something which arrives with the New Testament, but as soon as we get the very oldest texts of the Old Testament, the very beginning of God beginning to reveal himself to the prophets of Israel way back in the 8th century BC, he's already talking about a mother and child as a major component of salvation. And so when it comes to 1 Timothy, it's with that understanding in the background that this statement is made. And in particular, the mother is there, mother and child is there not only as an idea or an image, but actually as the sign, that almost the very first sign of salvation that is given is the mother. So as we come up to Christmas, of course, and as we look at Mary and the child in the crib, it's good for us to realize that from the very beginning, God has prepared this scene for us. Apparently, Father von Balthasar, I don't have a reference for this quote, says that the very center of Christian civilization in the West is the image of the mother and child. And this is something that God has rooted in his revelation to Israel from the very beginning. We see a hint of this understanding of the huge importance of the mother of the Saviour in the New Testament's understanding of salvation, also in the infancy accounts of St. Matthew's Gospel. Now, if you know the 4 Gospels, Our Lady essentially plays no role in Matthew or Mark. In Mark, she just gets one mention, and it's actually almost negative, where there's the passage of the mother and the brothers of Jesus come to see him, and Jesus, it's presented in Mark as being that they also do not understand Jesus, because one of the great motifs going through Mark's Gospel is how little people understand Jesus, how impenetrable he is for people, for the Pharisees, for his disciples even, and also for his family to understand him. In St. Matthew's Gospel, Mary, the same mention occurs a bit more neutered this time in St. Matthew's Gospel than in St. Mark. But apart from that, Mary gets no mention in St. Matthew's Gospel, except for the first 2 chapters, which we'll come back to in a second. Whereas in St. Luke's Gospel and St. John's Gospel, she's a huge figure of great importance. So St. Matthew, for almost all his Gospel, doesn't mention Our Blessed Lady, but in the first 2 chapters, she takes on an enormous importance. And if you look at the 2nd chapter of St. Matthew in particular, when the Magi come to see Jesus, Mary there gets 5 mentions. And whereas you might think that it's a story of the Magi coming to see the child, in fact, it's very much presented as a story of the Magi coming to see the child and his mother. And this idea of the child and his mother is repeated almost like a cascade of themes. So in verses 10 and 11, it says, "When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, and going into the house, they saw not the child, who was going to be the Christ himself, who's going to dominate St. Matthew's Gospel, but they saw the child with his mother, with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him." A few verses later in verse 13, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there till I tell you.' 14, "And he rose and took the child and his mother." Verse 20, the angel comes to Joseph in Egypt and says, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And then it says, "And he rose and took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel." So, in the context of a gospel where Mary is more or less a non-figure, where she is of no importance, all of a sudden in chapter 2, she seems to be everywhere in this motif of the child and his mother. And also remember this, that while St. Luke concentrates his infancy narratives on Mary, St. Matthew concentrates his infancy narratives on Joseph. So Mary, in a sense, is doubly irrelevant in Matthew's Gospel. She's not a dominating figure in any way later on, and she's not even a dominating figure in the infancy Gospels, and yet there's this recurring theme of the child and his mother in St. Matthew's Gospel. So why should this be? Why is she suddenly so huge in chapter 2? And a hint at the answer is given to us in 3 of the citations of the Old Testament which Matthew gives us in these passages. The first of these is, I just give you there the second groups of citation at the bottom, page 1, is from Matthew 1. St. Joseph is considering divorcing Our Lady. And it says, "But as he considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means God with us." If you just turn your handout there, you see where that comes from. In the Old Testament is, of course, the very famous passage in the prophet Isaiah. The Lord, Jerusalem is being threatened by Israel and Syria, with Assyria at the background threatening all 3 of them. Jerusalem is in fear, and again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." And he said, "Hear then, O house of David," etc. "Is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also?" And then he says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman," that's in the Hebrew, or in Greek, a virgin, "shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel." So this is the sign of salvation from the threat that is given by God. It's a young woman, right? Now, just want you to notice here, I quoted that from the Revised Standard Version, which says a young woman. In fact, in the Hebrew, it says the young woman. And scholars ask themselves, why is this that he speaks of the young woman? In particular, about 100 years ago, there's a scholar by the name of Gressman. And Hugo Gressman, a German scholar, Sabina, asking what is the meaning of, why is it the virgin is with child? And he states that the prophecy is, I quote, "completely incomprehensible if Isaiah did not allude to a by then already existing tradition." So this prophecy dates from the year 732 BC. At least that's when the threat to Jerusalem from Assyria came. So it's an 8th century prophecy. So very, very early on in the history of writing in Israel. And Gressman posits that we speak about the virgin, or the Hebrew and the Greek speak about the virgin or the young woman, precisely because they already knew what this virgin meant. And a man by the name of Watts, who wrote a bit more recently than that, writes very correctly. He says, "The definite article is important. Not just anyone, but the or that virgin or young woman is meant." And he says, if we have difficulty in solving the mystery of the alma, the servant or the maid or the virgin, that does not mean that the prophecy was a riddle for those who heard the prophecy. It is not characteristic of prophetic oracles that they cannot be understood. So this little word "the" in the virgin is very important, and gets us the question: who do they mean by the? Who is this identifiable virgin or young woman that Isaiah was referring to? And Martin Buber, also one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, and also a Jew and very interested in the scriptures, says the same thing, that whoever this woman was, she had to be somebody known to the king. And if we read on the following chapters of Isaiah up to Isaiah 11, this is chapter 7, if we read on to Isaiah 11, while the woman, it must be said, fades out of importance, the child is of huge importance. In chapter 8, the prophet Isaiah himself gives the sign by himself conceiving a child with his wife, and adds, "Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion." So this living child of Isaiah that he's had with his wife, who he calls the prophetess, becomes the sign for Mount Zion, for God saving Israel. The child again reappears in chapter 9 in the famous reading which we will read at midnight mass for Christmas. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder." And we all know the rest of that. Please don't break into song. And then again in chapter 11, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him." And then it goes on to say, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." So the prophet Isaiah has this very unusual image of salvation, which is that of the child. And allied with this idea of the child at its very beginning is that of the mother and child, the mother giving birth to the child. And let's remember and emphasize that this is 8th century BC. So we have very few texts in the Bible which predate this in terms of their full composition. So already at the very beginning of the writings of the scriptures, we have this idea there of the mother and child already fully born. And as I say, some scholars wonder if Isaiah is working with a pre-existing tradition, and that's why he speaks of the virgin or the young woman and the child. So a few decades later, there's another prophet, and St. Matthew in his 2nd chapter also quotes from this prophet. So he says, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea," I have it there on your handout, "in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will govern my people Israel." And that quotation is from the prophet Micah, who writes, it is thought, around the turn of the 8th to 7th century BC, so about 30 years or so after Isaiah wrote that first prophecy. And if you read that prophecy from Micah, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose origin is of old from ancient days," it continues, though St. Matthew doesn't quote it. "Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in travail has brought forth." Or we might more literally say, "when she who is to give birth has given birth. Then the rest of his brethren shall return to the people of Israel." So, who is Micah referring to? Well, you might very well say that he's referring to the tradition that has already come from Isaiah. And either it pre-exists Isaiah and Isaiah is using it and Micah is using it, or else Isaiah has invented it. Isaiah has received it for the first time, and it's become so famous now that Micah is taking it up again and using it. But what we see, and what St. Matthew quotes, is two traditions, both from the 8th century BC, both from the very dawn of writing in Israel, that both refer to this sign of a woman who is to give birth. So to sum up there, what we see is that you have this very ancient tradition which dates in fact from the 8th century. And this is what is there in the background of Matthew's thinking, because Matthew quotes both of these at length in his 2nd chapter. Now, so these are both 8th century. Now you get later books in the Old Testament, and one of the later books that we have is the book of Genesis. And many people, when they hear the book of Genesis, they assume, of course, that it's the first book ever written in the Bible. Okay, that as Adam and Eve were being created, they wrote down what was happening to them. Okay? In fact, we have no real evidence for the existence of the book of Genesis as a complete book until the very earliest possible evidence would be around the year 530 BC. So as the exiles are coming back from Babylon, they've been liberated more or less around the year 530. The second prophet Isaiah chapter 40 to 55, is mentioning Abraham and Sarah. And for him, they're important figures. And Ezekiel too, who writes in the 6th century, mentions Abraham. But these are really the first mentions that we get of Abraham as a person on his own. And as you know, books that are certainly later, such as the book of Tobit, the book of Ezra, all the books of the New Testament, Abraham is huge. Abraham is a huge figure, and rightly so. Books that are almost certainly earlier, using traditions that pre-exist that, such as the books of Kings and Samuel, Abraham doesn't figure. Okay, and scholars who look at this, who look at the importance of Abraham's sacrifice, for example, of his son Isaac, will say, why on earth don't they mention that in earlier Hebrew traditions? And this is really to say that it's not to say that Abraham was invented in the 6th century BC or the 5th century BC. It's to say that this story was put together at that time and grew in importance from that time. So for this and other reasons, we can say, and same is true of Adam and Eve, who get almost no mention before the 6th century BC, become very large after that, very important after that. We can say that Genesis is written probably around the 6th century BC. And the book of Genesis takes up this image of the mother and child in a way that is absolutely unprecedented and huge. Now, most attractive for me, and I think easiest to understand, is the figure of Sarah, who is obviously Abraham's wife, one of Abraham's two wives, the other being Hagar, who is Sarah's slave. Now, Abraham and Sarah both appear in chapter 11. And they appear in chapter 11 in a very conspicuous place because there's a genealogy. So so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. And then it comes to Abraham, and it says that he was the husband of Sarah, and Sarah was barren. Okay? So you have this line of the passing on of the heritage from father to son, father to son, father to son. Abraham and Sarah stops. Okay? So you can see that the construction of the text is there in some sense to emphasize that Sarah cannot have children. And Abraham is called at the beginning of chapter 12 of Genesis. And he comes to Israel, he does a little tour, and then there's a famine in the land. And what does he do right away? He leaves Israel and he goes to Egypt to find some food there. Now, the Lord told him to go to Israel, didn't tell him to leave Israel. So he wasn't too long in Israel before he changed his mind and decided to do what the Lord hadn't told him. And he goes to Egypt. And the gentleman that he is, he says to Sarah, "Pretend you're my sister and not my wife, or they'll kill me because you are so beautiful." And so she does. And Pharaoh takes her into his harem. So Abraham is his brother, so-called, and therefore Pharaoh enriches him. Pharaoh gives him flocks and riches and all this sort of thing, while Sarah has been taken and is being whatever. And Abraham, meanwhile, is enjoying himself on the fruits of Sarah's being taken into Pharaoh's harem. So this is, obviously, you can imagine, not a very nice thing to happen to Sarah. And how do things work out? Well, the Lord sends plagues against Egypt, which, of course, foretell the plagues that he will send in the time of Moses. And so Pharaoh realizes there's something wrong with this woman here that I've just brought into my harem, and he finds out that, in fact, Abraham is not her brother, but her husband, and she gives him back to him and expels them, having enriched them. The second thing that happens then is in chapter 16, it goes on, and Sarah still can't conceive, so she gives her slave, Hagar, to Abraham as his wife, his second wife, and Hagar then conceives immediately without the slightest effort, And so she is now the one with the son. She is the one who is going to carry on the line of Abraham. And this obviously spells bad news for Sarah. Nevertheless, the Lord is with Sarah. And in chapter 18, he promises that Abraham will have a child. And he promises that that child will not be through Hagar, but Abraham's line will be carried on through Sarah. And Abraham, of course, laughs in disbelief at this. The hinge of the whole story occurs in chapter 20. And you have that quote there. From there, Abraham journeyed south toward the territory of the Negev and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. Okay, exactly as happened in Egypt in chapter 12. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you slay an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. And then we skip a few verses and it goes on. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what were you thinking of that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness, or in Greek, the justice, you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen, and male and female slaves, and gave them to Abraham, and restored Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. So why would we say that this is the hinge of the whole story of Abraham and Sarah? Well, what's to be noticed here most of all is that in all the chapters of the story of Abraham and Sarah, this is the first time that Abraham will call Sarah my wife. So until then, she's called by many things, my sister and the woman and so on and so forth. But this is the first time that Abraham will say, she is my wife. And what happens here as well is that Abraham has since chapter 13, again repeat in chapter 15, again repeat in chapter 17, been promised inheritance, been promised land, been promised to become a blessing. And none of these things have taken place. But as soon as he says that Sarah is his wife, everything starts to happen. Everything falls into place. And it says that Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. And then in chapter 21, immediately after this, Sarah conceives the son of the promise, Isaac, and the history of Israel goes forward from that moment. So you can see that in a sense, the very hinge and the fulcrum about which the story of Abraham turns is his affirmation of Sarah that this is my wife. So Abraham himself might not treat Sarah with any respect. He might, and remember as well that chapter 20 occurs, to your great surprise, after chapter 19, which is the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot was willing to give his daughters to the mob to have them raped. And Abraham in chapter 20 is willing to give Sarah to the king to do what he likes with her. So it really brings out the horror of how Abraham treats his beloved wife. But Abraham might treat her like that, but God is going to vindicate her. And that's really the sense of chapter 20, is that while Abraham treats Sarah with no respect, God is going to make sure that the mother is treated as correctly as the wife. And you'll notice there as well that the Greek in particular brings out the whole idea of justice. So that if you see in chapter 4, both Greek and Hebrew speak of a just people. Okay, the RSV translates it as innocent, but in fact it's a just people. And then in chapter 5, in the integrity of my heart and the innocence, and the Greek translates it again, as justice of my hands I have done this. And then again in verse 13, the Hebrew says kindness, chesed, whereas the Greek translates it as justice. So what's also noteworthy here is that in chapter 15, it's said that Abraham believed God and it was considered as justice to him, or considered as justifying him. But where does the justice really occur? Where is it not simply considered? It really occurs when he affirms Sarah as his wife. So this idea of the mother and child, which comes from the 8th century, in the 6th century or 5th century text of Genesis, when the stories are put together, the ancient stories are put together, the idea of the mother and the vindication of the mother becomes huge. And that's the importance really there of Sarah, to a large extent, in bringing out our theme there of the motif of the mother and child, that she brings out how much God underlines the importance of the mother in terms of salvation. Second in this story is Rachel. And Rachel is one of the 4 wives of Jacob. But as you might know, Jacob has 4 wives, but he has only one love, and that's Rachel herself, just as Abraham has 2 wives, but God affirms the importance of only one. So we might say that the patriarchs, they had many wives. The stories of Genesis are polygamous. In fact, the stories of Genesis are very monogamous in the importance they give to the one wife of the one patriarch. Just want to, you have a few texts there on page 3 of your handout in a box of 4. And the one at the top left-hand corner is from the prophet Jeremiah. Now that would be the oldest text probably of the 4 that we have there. And it dates from the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 6th century, around the year 600, it's considered by scholars to date. And you can see, in fact, that the text from Genesis 35, which is right next to it, is based on it, because Jeremiah has a picture of Rachel, and she's weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. And of course, I'll ask you, where have you heard that? And of course, once again, it's in the 2nd chapter of St. Matthew. After the slaughter of the innocents, St. Matthew says, therefore a voice was heard in Ramah. It is Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are not, they are no longer. And this text then continues. It speaks of the virgin Israel, and the Lord says to Israel to set up waymarks and guideposts so that they can return from Babylon. And they'll know the way they're going to Babylon into exile, and they can return from Babylon too, or from Assyria in this case. And in the story of Jacob in Genesis, what's remarkable is that where Jacob returns, when he's returning and when he's going to Mesopotamia and coming back again, he sets up pillars again. So you can see that the authors are trying to link this story into the earlier prophecy of Jeremiah by means of these pillars and also by means of Rachel. And in chapter 35, Rachel dies in a scene of great sorrow. And she dies in particular giving birth to her younger son, Benjamin. And it says, and when she was in her hard labor, this is the top right-hand box of the 4, the midwife said to her, fear not, for now you will have another son. And as her soul was departing, for she died, she called his name Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. But his father called his name Benjamin, which means son of my right hand, son of my strength. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And just underneath that, then you see a text from 1 Samuel 10:2. And what's happening there in 1 Samuel is that the prophet Samuel has just anointed Saul as the very first king of Israel. And once he's anointed Saul, the very first thing that he tells him to do is to go to Rachel's tomb. So in a sense, Rachel is that figure chosen by Jeremiah as a symbol of the entirety of Israel, which is mourning and weeping because it's been sent into exile and been destroyed in exile. That's in the Jeremiah 31. And also in 1 Samuel 10, once the king is anointed, the first king is anointed, where does he begin his life, his new life as the anointed Messiah, the anointed king from the Lord? Well, he begins it at Rachel's tomb. So Rachel is, in fact, she's a huge figure as the mother of Israel. especially if you take her together with her sister Leah. The two of them are the mothers of Israel in that sense. But Rachel is very much the predominant one as being the great love of Jacob. This idea of Rachel dying and giving birth while she dies becomes for the prophets a symbol of the whole idea of suffering giving rise to new life. Because what the whole story of the Old Testament really turns on is the exile in Babylon, which is essentially dates from about 596 BC to about 530 BC. And all the prophets are either, I exaggerate slightly, but not too much, are either prophesying the exile or speaking about coming back from the exile and rebuilding after the exile. And the great themes that recur again and again in the historical books too are themes to do with the loss of the land, the recovery of the land, how to be reconciled with God by doing his will, and that God will save you, and so on and so forth. And one of the great themes that runs through the prophets is precisely this idea of new birth through suffering. So when Rachel dies giving birth to a son, she encapsulates it in that sense, this whole idea of new birth through suffering. And Christ too himself in his preaching will speak of the same thing. He says, when a woman is in travail, this is in John 16, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she is delivered of the child, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a child is born into the world. So you have sorrow too now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. So Jesus himself encapsulates this idea of his own death and resurrection into the idea of the mother giving birth to the child. And then finally, the last text I give you there, a great sign appeared in heaven from the book of Revelation. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth in anguish for delivery. So once again, you can see Rachel is there in Revelation 2. Now, in a sense, encompassing with herself all the women of the Old and the New Testament, to Mary as well, and the church, in this idea of giving birth in anguish, but nevertheless giving birth to the Saviour. Going to draw this to a close now in a few minutes' time. Just to move on then to the last woman of Genesis that I will deal with, which is Eve, who of course we can't escape in any way, the mother of the living. As we began this talk with St. Paul speaking about Eve, and it's good for us to remember, Eve, once the story appears in the 6th century, is a huge figure later on, right up to our own time. I quote for you there on page 3 underneath the picture of Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all cattle and above all wild animals. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Now, for those of us who read this in English, that doesn't really make a big deal. It's good for us to remember that English is almost unique in being a language without masculine, feminine words. And in Greek, masculine, feminine, and neuter, as my students of Greek here will tell you to their great pain and anguish, like Rachel themselves, giving birth to a knowledge of Greek with great pain. And what happens is, if you take a look at the words that are in bold, he says, God puts a curse on the serpent, and he says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed." Now, seed in Hebrew is a feminine word, and in Greek it's a neuter. But then it says he. It doesn't use a feminine pronoun or a neuter pronoun as it might have, but it uses a singular masculine pronoun. It changes it. And why should it change it? Well, perhaps it could be done quite easily in Greek, but that it was changed is significant. And you also find this later on in when it's speaking about the child of Sarah in Genesis 17:16 when God is speaking to Abraham, and he says, I will bless Sarah, and she will give birth to a child, and I will bless her. It says in the Hebrew. But the Greek changes that to say, I will bless Sarah, and she will give birth to a child, and I will bless him. So once again, you get this very significant change of the pronoun. And that brings out the importance that the translators, at least in Greek, were waiting for a singular masculine savior. So this construction of the story of Adam and Eve and the curse of the serpent in Genesis is used to give an idea of a savior who's coming, or at least of a particular male person who is going to come and who is going to crush the head of the serpent. And I have a quote from you there at the bottom of page 3 from Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, who writes about the year 170 AD. And thus it was also that the knot of Eve's disobedience was loosed by the obedience of Mary. For what the Virgin Eve had bound fast through unbelief, thus did the Virgin Mary set free through faith. Now, St. Irenaeus, his theology is based on the idea of recapitulation, which means that Christ has taken up all the experience of the human race and relived it. But relived it, whereas the experience of the human race, because of our sin, because of our disobedience to God, we end up with a sorry state for ourselves. Whereas Christ has taken it all up, taken up the temptations of human weakness, taken up the weakness of the human state, and relived it, taken up sorrow and death and everything else that is there in human experience, but relived it in a way that brings it to victory, through reconciliation and to joy. So he recapitulates, he re-begins everything, as we speak in music too, that we might finish a tune and then recapitulate it, start it all over again. And this is St. Irenaeus' great contribution to theology, is to bring out this idea. Now, St. Paul already has it in Ephesians, that God's plan for Christ is to recapitulate all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. And not only does Christ take up this recapitulation, but Mary too, as part of Christ's story, takes it up. And St. Irenaeus brings that about, as I just read. And thus it was also that the knot of Eve's disobedience was loosed by the obedience of Mary. For what the Virgin Eve had bound fast through unbelief, thus did the Virgin Mary set free through faith. And then he goes on, he who should be born of a woman. So he's referring to this Genesis 3:15, namely of the Virgin after the likeness of Adam, was preached as keeping watch for the head of the serpent. This is the seed of which the apostle says in the epistle to the Galatians, that the law of works was established until the seed should come, to whom the promise was made. This fact is exhibited in a still clearer light in the same epistle where he says, but when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman. So St. Irenaeus brings out the idea that precisely that Christ was born of a woman, just as Eve sinned, is essential to the whole idea of salvation. And in that sense, he brings out he underlines the importance of this very strange text in Genesis 3:15, where the feminine seed, or the neuter seed in Greek, is changed to a masculine pronoun. Moving on from there, just to cover the Annunciation in St. Luke, which is of course a very beautiful and very much the centerpiece of our idea of our Blessed Lady. It's good for us to realize that one of the themes which runs through the whole book of Genesis is the theme of fruit. So God creates, in chapter 1, he creates the trees and the fruit-bearing trees with their seed inside them. And he looks on this and of course it's good. And then Eve sees the fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she sees that this fruit is beautiful, and she desires the fruit, and it's in taking the fruit that she in her turn commits sin, that she falls. And what's interesting as well is the beauty of the tree of knowledge. And as soon as the tree of life then is closed off, Eve herself is called life. That's the meaning of the word. And this theme of fruit and the tree and the beauty of the woman goes right through Genesis. So Rachel too speaks about her fruit. So she speaks about she says there, and I have the quote on the final page of that. She says at the beginning of chapter 30 of Genesis, the very last quote I give there, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister Leah, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And as it goes on then, Rachel calls her first son Joseph, and she calls him Joseph because he's going to bring forth somebody else, just like the trees in creation who carry their seed inside them. And Joseph, in fact, calls his first son Ephraim. And he calls him Ephraim because he says, or his second son, in fact, he calls his second son Ephraim because he says, God has made me fruitful. And that, the P-R-A in the middle of the word Ephraim is, in fact, the Hebrew word to bear fruit. And in the very end, in chapter 49, when Jacob blesses Joseph, he says, "My son Joseph is a fruitful bough." So this idea of the children being fruit, replacing in a sense the fruit of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, becomes one of the themes through the book of Genesis. So I'm going to take the story of the first two chapters of St. Luke in reverse, and just to bring out a few little points there that link in Our Lady to what has gone before. So the first one there I have at the top of page 4 is from the finding in the temple, and it says, "And when they saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously.'" Anxiously, says the Revised Standard Version. The verb is literally in pain or in sorrow, and it's the verb adunomai. Whereas if we read in Genesis 35:18, "And as her soul was departing," this is Rachel, for she died, "she called his name son of my sorrow," or pain, Adune, but his father called his name Benjamin. So perhaps there are a little idea from Luke in linking Mary to Rachel in the way the book of Revelation will do so later on again in the great sign. And secondly, taking up again that word which Isaiah has had, "And this will be a sign for you," this is the angels visiting the shepherds in the field, "you will find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God. You know the rest of the story. "And they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger." So we're returning in St. Luke's Gospel to the very beginning of the 8th century BC, to 8th century BC revelation to Isaiah of the mother and the child as the sign of salvation that has been given. And finally then, after the Annunciation, Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth, and Elizabeth sees her and exclaims with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." So, as I was saying, that theme of fruit is one of the great themes that dominates the book of Genesis, and brings back to us how St. Luke has constructed his story with the great women of Genesis in mind, and also with the great theme which is there, as we see in St. Matthew and St. Paul too, touched on very briefly in St. Paul, of the importance of the mother and child in Revelation. So to sum up, it's 1 minute to 8. Really what I wanted to do in this talk is to bring out how central the figure of Mary is to the whole idea of salvation, to the whole idea of divine revelation, that she's not simply something that was tagged on after the birth of Christ, but she's a figure who's been there in prophecy, in some sense, from the very beginning, from the very dawn of salvation. I also hope that I brought out in a little sense, to use the word not too well, the feminism of the Gospels, that far from women in any way being absent in the Gospels, they are in many ways the fulcrum on which the Gospel turns. That's not to deny that the vast majority of the stories are about men, or to say that there's some mistake in that. But while the stories are about men, the fulcrum of the stories is very often the women there who God looks on with a particular tenderness and a particular care. And I think is a great lesson for us in our own time, in our own approach to the faith and to the church and to the Blessed Virgin, especially in this time of Christmas, how the Old Testament and its great theme of the mother and child can teach us so much. So thanks for your attention.